picture a woman hanging laundry on a Tuesday morning in St. Louis. The year is 1953. The sky is pale blue and wide. Before we go any further into this story, if you want a brand new American mystery every single night, subscribe. One tap and a new story is waiting for you every evening. The air smells like river water and coal smoke and something else she can't quite name. Something faintly sweet. She doesn't think much of it. She pins up a white sheet and goes back inside. She never knew. None of them knew. While that woman hung her laundry, while her kids played in the alley below, while her neighbors walked to the corner store and back, the United States Army was watching, not from a distance, from right there on the street. Men in plain clothes, machines that looked like something else. A quiet operation running through the heart of a living, breathing American city. St. Louis was a laboratory, and nobody asked the people inside it for permission. This is one of those stories that sounds like it couldn't be true. It sounds like the kind of thing someone made up late at night. The kind of rumor that spreads through a neighborhood and grows bigger with every telling. But this one is different. This one has documents. This one has names and dates and government seals stamped on paper that sat in filing cabinets for decades before anyone outside those offices ever read them. And even with all of that, even with the proof sitting right there in black and white, the full story still has edges that nobody has ever quite explained. St. Louis in the early 1950s was a city full of life. The Mississippi River ran along its eastern edge like a brown ribbon, wide and slow, and carrying everything the middle of the country wanted to send downstream. The Gateway Arch didn't exist yet. In its place stood the old riverfront, a tangle of warehouses and docks, and the kind of buildings that had been standing since before the Civil War, their brick faces dark with decades of soot. The neighborhoods spread west from the river in long grids. Brick row houses, corner taverns with neon signs glowing amber in the evening, church steeples rising above the rooftops like fingers pointing at the sky. In the summer, the heat sat on the city like a warm hand. In the winter, the wind came off the plains and cut right through you. People lived close together here. They knew their neighbors. They borrowed sugar and watched each other's children and sat on front stoops in the long summer evenings, talking about nothing much, letting the hours go soft and slow. They had no idea they were being studied. The army had a problem in those years. The Cold War was young, and the fear was very real. The Soviet Union had the bomb. American cities felt exposed in a way they never had before. Military planners started asking hard questions. If an enemy wanted to move a chemical or biological agent through a dense urban area without being detected, how would they do it? How far would it spread? How many people would it reach before anyone noticed anything at all? They needed answers, and they decided the best way to get answers was to run the test for real. They chose St. Louis. They chose it more than once, actually. The experiments ran across several years, touching different parts of the city at different times. Some of the spraying happened from rooftops. Some of it happened from trucks that rolled slowly through residential streets in the early morning hours, releasing a fine mist into the air while the city slept. The people in those houses breathed it in. The children playing outside breathed it in. The woman hanging her laundry breathed it in. The army called it a field study. They wrote reports about particle dispersal and atmospheric conditions and wind patterns. They used careful, clean language that kept the whole thing at a comfortable distance from what it actually was. What it actually was this. A government agency used American citizens as test subjects without their knowledge, without their consent, and without ever telling them what had been done to them. For a long time, almost nobody outside the program knew it had happened at all. Then, slowly, the story started to come out. A document here, a researcher there, a woman innocent, Louis neighborhood who started asking questions and wouldn't stop asking them no matter what anyone told her. And what she found, what all of them eventually found, was stranger and sadder and more complicated than anyone had expected. This is that story. To understand what happened in St. Louis, you have to understand what the world felt like in 1953. Not what it looked like on paper, what it felt like in your chest when you woke up in the morning. The Second World War had ended less than a decade before. The men who fought it had come home, taken off their uniforms, and tried to become fathers and neighbors and hardware store owners. They planted grass. They bought refrigerators. They tried very hard to feel normal, and for a little while, it almost worked. Then the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb. That was 1949, and something shifted in the American air that year that never quite shifted back. Picture the country in those early years of the 1950s. The suburbs were spreading out from every city like rings in still water. New houses going up fast, pale and square, with picture windows and young trees barely taller than the children playing underneath them. Inside those houses, the television sets glowed blue and gray. The news anchor's voice was calm and measured, but the news itself was anything but calm. There were drills in the schools now. Children practiced crawling under their desks. Teachers told them to cover their heads and close their eyes. The children did what they were told. They didn't ask too many questions. That was how you were raised back then. St. Louis sat in the middle of all of it, right in the heart of the country, right on the edge of the Mississippi River. The river ran wide and brown through the city, slow and heavy in summer, gray and cold in winter. The city itself was brick and stone and steel. Old neighborhoods packed close together, corner stores and Catholic churches and factory smoke rising in thin white columns against a pale sky. The air in St. Louis had a particular smell in those years. Coal smoke and river mud, and the faint sweetness of the Anheuser-Busch brewery on the south side. In summer, the heat pressed down like a warm hand. The streets shimmered. Women hung laundry from back porches. Children ran through open fire hydrants. Old men sat on stoops in their undershirts and watched the afternoon go by. In winter, the cold came hard off the river. The streets turned gray and quiet. People wore heavy wool coats, dark colors, browns and navies and blacks. The women wore headscarves tied under their chins. The men wore hats, always hats. You could tell a man's job by his hat. A fedora meant office work. A flat cap meant the factory floor. The factories were running full. The war had built them up, and the Cold War kept them running. St. Louis made shoes and beer and chemicals and airplane parts. It was a working city. The people who lived there worked with their hands and came home tired and ate their supper and went to bed. They trusted the institutions around them the way you trust the ground under your feet. You don't think about it. It's just there. And the government was everywhere in those years. Not in a way that felt heavy or strange. It just was. There were civil defense posters on the walls of post offices. There were pamphlets about what to do if the bomb fell. There were men in suits who came to your town and gave speeches about preparedness and vigilance and the importance of staying calm. The army had a particular kind of authority in that era. These were the men who had beaten Hitler. These were the men who had crossed the Pacific and taken back island after island from the Japanese. When a man in a uniform told you something was necessary, you believed him. You had good reason to believe him. He had earned that trust with blood. That trust was the ground this story grows in. The fear was real too, not the wild, screaming kind of fear, the quiet kind, the kind that lives in the back of your throat, the kind that makes you check the lock on the door before bed even though you know you already locked it. People in 1953 understood in a way that is hard to fully explain now that the world could end. Not someday. Soon. Maybe on a Tuesday afternoon, while the laundry was still on the line. That feeling made people willing to accept things they might not have accepted otherwise. It made them willing to let the men in charge make decisions they didn't fully explain. It made them willing to believe that some things were too complicated, too sensitive, too important for ordinary people to know. That willingness was the open door, and through it, something walked in. To understand what happened in St. Louis, you have to understand the men who made it happen. They were not monsters. That's the strange part. They were fathers. They had wives who packed their lunches. They wore gray suits and carried leather briefcases worn soft at the corners. They drank bad coffee from paper cups and argued about baseball scores in the break room. They were, in almost every way, ordinary American men doing what they believed was an ordinary American job. But the job was not ordinary at all. The year is 1953. The Cold War has been grinding for nearly a decade, and deep inside the United States Army Chemical Corps, a group of scientists and military planners are sitting around a long table in a room with no windows, trying to solve a problem that keeps them up at night. The problem is this: if the Soviet Union ever attacked an American city with a biological or chemical weapon, nobody knew how the particles would move. Nobody knew how the wind would carry them. Nobody knew which streets would be hit first, which neighborhoods would be swallowed whole, which people would breathe the worst of it. The math existed on paper, but paper was not a city. Paper did not have tall buildings that split the wind. Paper did not have river valleys that trapped cold air at night. They needed real data. And to get real data, they needed a real city. One of the men at that table was a researcher named Harold Bauer. He was the kind of man who believed deeply in the work. He had served in the Second World War. He had seen what chemical weapons could do in the wrong hands. He believed, with the full weight of his heart, that understanding these weapons was the only way to defend against them. He kept a photograph of his daughter on his desk. He coached Little League on Saturdays. He was not a villain in his own story. He was a patriot, and that, in its own quiet way, is what made him dangerous. There were others like him, planners, logistics men, a young aerosol specialist named Richard Dowd, who had grown up in Ohio and could calculate particle drift in his head faster than most men could do it on paper. Dowd wore the same brown tie almost every day. He ate lunch alone, usually a sandwich from home, and he spent his lunch hour reading technical manuals the way other men read novels. He was brilliant and careful, and completely certain that what he was doing was right. These men worked inside a system that rewarded certainty. The Cold War did not have much patience for doubt. Every week brought new intelligence reports about Soviet capabilities. Every month brought new pressure from Congress to prove that America was ready. The men in that windowless room felt the weight of the whole country pressing down on their shoulders. They were not reckless. They were thorough. They documented everything. They ran calculations. They filed reports in triplicate. They followed procedure with the kind of devotion that looks, from the outside, almost like faith. And the procedure said, find a city, study it, learn how particles move through its streets and alleys and housing blocks. Learn how a real population breathes. So they began to look at maps. St. Louis spread out across those maps like a wide brown river delta. It had everything they needed. A major American city, dense neighborhoods packed close together, a river on one side, open land on the other, a mix of flat terrain and low hills that would let them study how particles behaved in different conditions. It was, from a purely scientific point of view, an ideal location. They also looked at the people, the neighborhoods, the demographics. They made notes about population density, about housing type, about which areas were most likely to give them clean, readable data. Nobody in those meetings asked the people of St. Louis for permission. Nobody sent a letter. Nobody knocked on a door. The residents of those neighborhoods were not partners in the research. They were not even aware the research existed. They were, in the language of the documents these men produced, simply part of the environment. That word says everything. Environment, not community, not neighbors, not human beings with children asleep in the next room. Environment, something to be measured, something to be studied, something that did not need to be asked. Harold Bauer drove home that evening past neat rows of houses with porch lights glowing amber in the dark. He thought about the work. He thought about the data they would collect. He thought about his country and what he owed it. He did not think about the people behind those lights. St. Louis in the early 1950s smelled like river water and coal smoke and something frying in a pan somewhere down the block. It was a city that worked, a city that got up early and came home tired and sat on the front steps in the evening when the heat broke a little. The Mississippi ran wide and brown just past the edge of things, slow and heavy, like it had somewhere to be, but wasn't in any rush to get there. The neighborhoods were tight, not cramped tight, the way a good coat fits. People knew each other's names. They knew which dog barked at nothing and which one barked at something real. They knew whose kid had a paper route and whose grandmother kept the best garden on the block. The houses sat close together, brick mostly, with small yards and deep porches porches and windows that stayed open all summer long because nobody had air conditioning, and the breeze off the river was the only thing that helped. Mornings started the same way they always had: coffee on the stove, the radio on low, kids pulling on shoes that were already worn at the heel, men walking to bus stops with their lunch packed in paper bags, women hanging laundry on lines strung between buildings, the white sheets catching the early light and billowing out slow like sails on a ship that wasn't going anywhere. There was a comfort in all of it, a rhythm that felt old and solid, like the city had been doing this forever and planned to keep on doing it. The corner stores opened early. The smell of fresh bread came out of bakery doors and mixed with the exhaust from the delivery trucks idling at the curb. Children walked to school in loose groups, stopping to look at things that caught their eye: a pigeon on a fire escape, a crack in the sidewalk shaped like something interesting, a puddle that still held the color of the morning sky. The world was small and knowable. That was the gift of it. Evenings were softer. The light went golden and then pink, and then the blue of a bruise fading. People came back out onto their stoops. Neighbors talked across the narrow strips of grass between their houses. Someone always had a radio going, and the music drifted out through the screen door and mixed with the sound of cicadas and the distant horn of a river barge. Kids chased each other until they were called in. Old men played cards on folding tables set up on the sidewalk. The night came on gentle, and the city settled into it easy. This was the ordinary world. This was the life that was happening, full and real and unremarkable in the best possible way. And then, sometimes, there was a cloud. Not a cloud from the sky. The sky might be perfectly clear, blue all the way to the edges. Not a single thing drifting up there. But down at street level, something would appear. A low white mist, thin at first, the way fog sometimes pools in a low spot near the river. It moved differently than fog, though. It came from a direction that didn't make sense. It hugged the ground and spread slowly, drifting between buildings and along the gutters, pale and quiet. People noticed it. Of course they did. But there wasn't anything alarming about it. It didn't smell like much. It didn't sting the eyes or catch in the throat in any way that made you stop what you were doing. It was just there, the way weather is just there, the way a passing cloud shadow moves across a yard, and then it's gone, and you forget it almost immediately. Some people figured it was something from the factories. St. Louis had plenty of those, and factories put things into the air. That was just how it was. You didn't think too hard about it. You went back inside. You finished dinner. You listened to the radio and went to bed. Some people figured it was the city doing something about mosquitoes. Cities did that sometimes. They'd send trucks through the streets in summer and spray something that smelled faintly chemical and left a thin film on everything. Nobody loved it, but nobody asked too many questions either. The government handled things like that. That was part of what governments were for. The mist came and went. Life continued. The bread still smelled good in the morning. The sheets still caught the light. The kids still wore out their shoes. The river still ran slow and brown past the edge of everything, quiet and unhurried, keeping whatever it knew to itself. Somewhere in Washington, a man signed a piece of paper. You'll never know his name. The document that carried his signature has been filed and refiled and reclassified so many times that the paper itself might as well have turned to smoke. But the signature was real. The order was real. And what followed from that one quiet moment in an office building far from St. Louis would change the lives of thousands of people who never knew they had been chosen. This is how it begins. Not with a bang, not with a speech, with a signature. The year was 1953. The Army was running something called the Chemical Corps. This was not a secret. The Chemical Corps had existed since World War I. It had a long history of studying how chemicals moved through the air, how they spread across open ground, how they clung to buildings and drifted down alleyways and settled into the low places where people gathered. The Chemical Corps knew things about the wind that most people never thought to ask. And in 1953, someone inside that organization decided it was time to find out what they didn't know yet. The question they were asking was a cold and technical one. If an enemy ever released a biological weapon over an American city, how far would it travel? How fast? Which neighborhoods would catch the worst of it? Which buildings would trap it inside? Which streets would funnel it like a river through a canyon? These were the questions that kept certain men awake at night, staring at maps of American cities spread across wide wooden desks under fluorescent light. They needed answers. And to get answers, they needed a test. Not a test on paper, not a model or a simulation, a real test in a real city, with real air moving through real streets, past real people going about their real lives. The order came down through channels. It moved from desk to desk, from office to office, the way orders do in large organizations. Each person who touched it passed it along. Nobody stopped it. Nobody asked the question that now seems so obvious from this distance. Nobody said, "Wait, what about the people who live there?" Or maybe someone did ask. And the answer they got was enough to keep them moving. The army had a name for what they were planning. They called it a vulnerability study. That phrase sounds almost gentle, doesn't it? A study, something academic, something done in a library with good lighting and a cup of coffee nearby. But what it meant in practice was something else entirely. It meant sending men into a city with equipment and instructions. It meant setting up machines in specific locations. It meant releasing something into the air above neighborhoods where children played on front stoops and old women hung laundry on lines strung between brick buildings, and men came home from factory shifts with grease still on their hands. It meant doing all of that without telling a single soul. The city they chose was St. Louis, Missouri. And the choice was not random. St. Louis had something the army wanted. It had density, tight streets, old buildings packed close together, neighborhoods that had grown up over decades into something almost like a maze, full of corners and courtyards, and narrow gaps between structures where air moved in strange ways. The city was a perfect model, a controlled environment in the language of science, a place where the numbers would mean something. There were other reasons too. Reasons that had less to do with air currents and more to do with who lived where. But that part of the story comes a little later. For now, just hold this image. A man in a suit, in a building you've never seen, in a city far from St. Louis, pressing a pen to paper. The scratch of the nib, the slight resistance of the page, the moment the ink dries and the decision becomes permanent. He probably went home that evening. He probably had dinner. He probably did not think about the families on Carr Street or Pruitt Avenue or any of the other places his signature had just quietly claimed. He had done his job. He had answered a question that needed answering in the way that men in offices answer questions. Cleanly, efficiently, from a distance. Down in St. Louis, the summer air was warm and heavy and smelled like the river. Kids were out late because the days were long. Screen doors banged open and shut. Radios played through open windows. Nobody heard the order coming. Nobody knew to listen for it. People talk. That's the one thing you can count on. No matter what a government decides to keep quiet, no matter how many forms get stamped and filed away in some basement nobody visits, people talk. They talk over back fences. They talk on church steps in the cool of a Sunday morning. They talk at the counter of the corner drugstore while the pharmacist counts out pills and pretends not to listen. And in St. Louis, in those years, people were talking about the machines. Not everyone had seen them up close, but enough people had. Enough people had been standing on their front porch in the early morning, coffee in hand, watching the street wake up, and seen something roll by that didn't belong. A truck, usually. Sometimes a jeep. Sometimes something that looked like a trailer being pulled slow and deliberate through the neighborhood. No markings anyone could read. No driver who made eye contact. And behind it or out of it came the fog. That's what the old-timers called it. The fog. Not smoke exactly. Not steam. Something in between. It drifted low to the ground, pale gray or almost white, catching the morning light in a way that was almost pretty. Almost. It smelled faintly of something chemical, something sharp underneath the softness, like a match just struck and then blown out. The machines came in the early hours. Before most people were fully awake. Before the kids were out on the sidewalks and the men had left for work. They moved quietly for something so large, and then they were gone, and the fog settled into the gutters and the grass and the spaces between houses, and the morning went on like nothing had happened. But people remembered. An old woman on Cass Avenue told her neighbor she had seen something like it before. Years back, she said, during the war. She'd seen trucks like that in a newsreel, spraying something over fields somewhere overseas. She couldn't remember the country. She couldn't remember the year, but she remembered the shape of it, the slow crawl, the low cloud trailing behind. Her neighbor wasn't so sure. He thought it was the city. Mosquitoes, he said. The city sprays for mosquitoes. They've always done it. Nothing to worry about. That was the explanation that moved fastest through the neighborhood. Mosquitoes, or rats, or some kind of blight they were trying to stop before it spread. The city had done things like that before. People trusted that. People wanted to trust that. It was easier than the other thought, the one that sat at the back of the mind and didn't have a name yet. At the barber shop on Natural Bridge Road, a man named Curtis said he'd asked one of the drivers directly. Walked right up to the truck, he said, and asked the man behind the wheel what he was doing. The driver looked at him, didn't smile, said it was a city health project, said it was nothing to worry about, said Curtis should step back from the vehicle. Curtis stepped back. He told the story for years. The women at the beauty parlor on Van Deventer had their own version. One of them said her youngest had woken up the morning after one of those trucks came through with a cough that lasted 2 weeks. Another said her roses had gone brown along the edges, and she couldn't figure out why. A third said she'd seen the truck herself, and the man riding in the back wasn't wearing any kind of mask or suit, just regular clothes. And if it was something dangerous, wouldn't he be protected? That last part made the others go quiet for a moment, because she was right. And that was the thing about the machines that kept people from worrying too much. The men running them looked ordinary. They didn't look scared. They didn't look like men handling something that could hurt you. They looked like city workers, like men doing a job they'd done 100 times before. So the neighborhood watched, and the neighborhood wondered, and then the neighborhood went back to its business. Because that's what you do. You have rent to pay and children to feed, and a job to get to before the foreman starts counting. You don't have time to follow a truck through the streets and demand answers from strangers. And maybe that's exactly what someone was counting on. The machines kept coming. Not every day, not on any schedule anyone could predict. They came when they came. They left what they left behind. And the fog settled into the neighborhood like it had always belonged there, thin and pale and quiet as a held breath. Now let's talk about what was actually inside those clouds. The army called it a simulant. That was their word. A simulant. Something that simulates a real threat without being the real thing. They said it was harmless. They said it was just a fine powder mixed with water and pushed out into the air. They said the people of St. Louis had nothing to worry about. The powder had a name. Zinc, cadmium, sulfide. Say it slow. Zinc, cadmium, sulfide. 3 words that sound like something from a chemistry classroom. 3 words that were chosen in part because they don't sound like anything dangerous at all. But cadmium is a heavy metal. It sits in the body. It doesn't leave easy. And the history of cadmium in the human body is not a gentle one. Factory workers who breathed it for years developed lung disease. Miners who worked near it came home with bones that ached deep in the night. The science on cadmium was not new. It was not unknown. It existed in libraries and medical journals long before anyone rolled a machine down a St. Louis street and opened the valve. The zinc part was meant to make the particles glow. Under ultraviolet light, zinc cadmium sulfide lights up a bright orange yellow. That was useful to the army. They could track where the cloud went. They could measure how far it spread. They could stand on rooftops with special equipment and watch the particles drift over houses and schools and playgrounds, and know exactly how a real chemical weapon would move through a real American city. The particles were small, smaller than a grain of sand, smaller than a fleck of dust, small enough to pass through a window screen, small enough to settle into carpet and curtains and the soft fibers of a child's stuffed animal, small enough to breathe in without knowing it, small enough to stay. Now here is where the history gets older than the Cold War. St. Louis sits on land that people have lived on for a very long time, long before the army, long before the city itself. The Osage people called this region home for centuries. They knew the Mississippi and Missouri rivers the way you know the rooms of your own house. They knew the bluffs and the bottomlands, and the way the fog came in off the water in the early morning, low and white and slow. The Osage had a word for the mist that rose from the rivers. It meant something close to the breath of the water. They believed the rivers were alive, not as a story for children. As a fact, the water breathed, the land breathed, the air between the trees was full of things you could not see, but could feel on your skin. There is something almost unbearable about that if you sit with it long enough. The same air, the same low-lying geography that let river fog pool and drift and settle into the valleys. The same quality of the land that made St. Louis a place where things spread, where things moved, where the air itself seemed to hold whatever you put into it. The Osage knew this. The early French traders who came through in the 1700s knew this. They built their settlements near the water because the air there was rich and soft and carried things far. The army knew it too. That's why they were here. The geography of St. Louis was not an accident in their planning. The city sits in a natural bowl, ringed by river bluffs, shaped by centuries of water cutting through soft earth. When something gets into the air in St. Louis, it tends to stay there. It tends to spread evenly. It tends to settle into the low places where people live. The early settlers who came down the Ohio and up the Mississippi in flatboats wrote letters home about the air. They said it was heavy. They said it had a weight to it that you could feel in your chest on certain mornings. They said the fog came in so thick some nights that you could not see your hand in front of your face. They meant it as a wonder, a strange and beautiful thing about this new country they were trying to make a life in. The army looked at those same qualities and saw something else entirely. They saw a testing ground. They saw a place where particles would behave predictably, where the results would be clean and measurable and useful. The fog the Osage called the breath of the water was still there. It had just been given a new ingredient, and nobody on the ground had any idea. there's a woman named Lisa Martino Taylor. She's a sociologist from St. Louis, and sometime in the early 2000s, she started pulling on a thread that most people had walked right past for 50 years. She wasn't a spy. She wasn't a whistleblower. She was someone who grew up hearing things, quiet things, the kind of things adults say when they think the children aren't listening. She heard about the machines. She heard about the fog, and she decided she needed to know where exactly that fog had been sent. What she found took years to piece together. Declassified documents, army records, maps with grids drawn over them in pencil, old photographs of equipment being loaded onto trucks in the gray early morning. She sat with all of it the way you sit with a puzzle that's missing pieces, turning each one over, holding it up to the light. The first thing she noticed was the pattern. The spraying hadn't happened everywhere in St. Louis. It had happened in specific places, specific blocks, specific zip codes. And when she laid those locations over a map of the city, something became very clear. The neighborhoods they chose were poor. They were black. They were the parts of St. Louis that the rest of the city had already decided didn't matter much. The Pruitt-Igoe housing project, the Mill Creek Valley area, sections of the near north side where families lived stacked close together in brick buildings with thin walls and windows that didn't seal right. Places where children played outside because there was nowhere else to go. She compared those locations to the wealthier parts of the city, the neighborhoods with tree-lined streets and wide lawns and houses set back from the road. Clayton, Ladue, the western suburbs where the air smelled like cut grass and money. Those neighborhoods didn't show up on the Army's maps. Not once. That absence is its own kind of answer. Martino Taylor kept digging. She filed Freedom of Information requests. She wrote letters. She waited. Some requests came back with pages so heavily blacked out that only a word here or there survived, floating in a sea of thick ink like something trying to stay alive. Other requests came back with nothing at all. A polite letter saying the records didn't exist or couldn't be found or had been transferred somewhere else. But enough came through, enough to show her the shape of what had happened. The Army had divided the city into test grids. Each grid had a number. Each number corresponded to a location, and the locations, again and again, were places where people had very little power to ask questions, very little access to lawyers or newspapers or city council members who would pick up the phone. Places where a strange machine rolling down the street at night might be frightening, but reporting it to someone who could do something about it, that was a different kind of problem entirely. She also found something else, something that made her sit back from her desk and stare at the wall for a while. Some of the spraying had been concentrated near schools, not just near them, directly over them. The Army's own documents showed spray patterns that drifted across schoolyards and playgrounds during the hours when children were outside. Small lungs, growing bodies, kids who had no idea that the hazy air around them was anything other than a warm St. Louis afternoon. The documents didn't explain why schools were included in the spray zones. They didn't explain a lot of things. They described the operations in the flat, careful language that government papers always use, the kind of language designed to describe something terrible without ever sounding terrible. Coordinates, wind speeds, particle dispersal rates, the words of science arranged to keep the human beings out of the picture. Martino Taylor spent the better part of a decade on this. She eventually turned her research into a doctoral dissertation, then into a book, then into congressional testimony. The work was slow and unglamorous, and often felt, she said, like shouting into a very large, very empty room. But she kept going, because the pattern was too clear to ignore, because the choice of neighborhoods wasn't random or accidental, or the result of some neutral scientific calculation. Someone had looked at a map of St. Louis and made a decision about whose air was available to use, whose children could breathe the experiment without anyone important noticing. That decision had a logic to it, a cold, clear logic that had nothing to do with science. And once you see that logic, you can't unsee it. There was a place in St. Louis that people called the projects. Pruitt-Igoe, 33 towers of red brick and pale concrete rising up from the north side of the city like a stack of gray dominoes someone forgot to knock over. The buildings were tall. The hallways were long. The windows looked out over rooftops and smokestacks, and the slow brown bend of the Mississippi River in the distance. People lived there. Real people. Families with children and grandmothers and dogs and Sunday dinners and all the ordinary things that fill a life. They had names. They had stories. And in the 1950s and early 1960s, they had no idea that the United States Army had decided their neighborhood was a good place to run a test. A woman named Doris remembers the machines. She was a girl then, maybe 8 or 9 years old. She remembers standing at the window of her family's apartment on an upper floor, looking down at the street below. There was a truck. It moved slow, like it wasn't in a hurry. And behind it came a cloud, low and white and soft-looking, like steam off a pot of water. She thought it was beautiful. She called her little brother over to look. Her mother told them to step back from the window. She didn't know why her mother said that. She didn't ask. Children in that time and place learned not to ask certain things. But she remembered the cloud. She remembered the way it drifted between the buildings, soft and quiet, like something alive that didn't want to be noticed. Another man, older, named Curtis, grew up a few blocks from the towers. He remembers the smell. Not a bad smell, he says. Not like chemicals or burning. More like nothing. Like the air had been washed clean of everything, even the things that were supposed to be there. The smell of a summer afternoon in the city was gone. The exhaust and the cut grass and the hot pavement, all of it replaced by something that had no name. He remembers asking his father what it was. His father looked at the truck and then looked away. He said it was the city doing something, cleaning the air maybe, or testing something for the war. Curtis was 12 years old. That answer was enough for him then. It isn't enough for him now. The people of Pruitt-Igoe were mostly black. This matters. It matters because the neighborhoods the army chose for the heaviest spraying were not the wealthy ones. They were not the neighborhoods where city officials lived, or where doctors had their offices, or where the people who made decisions sent their own children to school. The army chose the places where people had less power to ask questions, less power to say no, less ability to make someone listen if something went wrong. This is not a small thing. It sits at the center of the whole story. A woman named Ida lived in one of the towers for almost 15 years. She raised 4 children there. She remembers the fog machines, but what she remembers more is what came after. The coughs that didn't go away. The headaches that started in the morning and stayed until dark. She didn't connect those things to the trucks at the time. Nobody told her there was a connection to make. She just thought the buildings were damp. She thought the city air was bad. She thought her children were unlucky. She found out the truth decades later. She was watching the news. A reporter was talking about experiments, about St. Louis, about the North Side, about the housing projects. She sat very still in her chair. She said she felt something cold move through her, even though the room was warm. She said she felt like the ground had shifted under her feet, even though she was sitting down. That feeling has a name. It's the feeling of finding out that the world was not what you thought it was, that the people who were supposed to protect you were, at the very same time, using you. Not out of cruelty, exactly. Out of something colder than cruelty. Out of calculation. Out of the quiet belief that some people's safety matters more than other people's safety, and that the people in those towers would not be missed if something went wrong. They were wrong about that last part. The people of Pruitt-Igoe were missed. They are still missed, and the ones who are still alive have not forgotten what it felt like to stand at a window and watch a cloud drift through their street, soft and white, and full of something nobody told them was there. There's something about the way women notice things, not because they're looking for trouble, not because they're suspicious by nature, but because they're the ones home during the day. They're the ones watching the street from the kitchen window while the coffee percolates. They're the ones who know which neighbor's dog barks at what hour, which kids walk which route to school, and what the air smells like on a normal Tuesday morning in their neighborhood. They notice when something changes. In the neighborhoods around Pruitt-Igoe and the Carr Square area of North St. Louis, it was women who first started saying something out loud. Not to newspapers, not to city officials, just to each other, over back fences, in the laundry room, the corner store where the light came in yellow through the front window and the floorboards were soft under your feet. They said the same things in different words, in different years. My kids keep getting sick. My daughter has headaches that won't quit. My boy's nose bleeds for no reason. I don't know what's wrong. The doctor doesn't know either. These weren't women who panicked easily. These were women who had survived hard things. Women who had moved north from Mississippi and Alabama and Arkansas, looking for work and a better life. Women who had raised children in cramped apartments with thin walls and windows that rattled in January. They weren't fragile. They weren't imagining things. They were pattern readers. They had to be. When you don't have much, you learn to pay close attention to everything you do have. And what they noticed, slowly across years, was a shape forming in the dark. The machines had come through in the early 1950s. The fog had rolled low across the streets. The children had played in it. And then, not right away, not all at once, but over time, things started going wrong. Headaches, rashes, nosebleeds, fatigue that sat on a child like a stone, cancers that came too early in people too young. No single woman could see the whole picture. That's the thing about a pattern this size. You can only see your own corner of it, your own child, your own block, your own story. But the stories rhymed. A woman in one building would describe her daughter's illness. A woman 3 blocks away, someone she'd never met, would describe the same symptoms in her son. Same years, same part of the city, same fog they both remembered seeing from their windows, thick and low and strange, moving through the streets like something alive. They didn't know about the army. They didn't know about the tests. They didn't know the word cadmium or what it does inside a human body over time. They just knew what they saw, and they kept saying it out loud, even when no one was writing it down. That's the part that matters. They kept talking. Decades passed. The Pruitt-Igoe towers came down in 1972 and 1976, demolished in great clouds of dust and concrete. The families scattered. People moved to other parts of the city, other states, other lives. But the stories traveled with them. Mothers told daughters. Grandmothers told grandchildren. The memory of those years stayed alive in the telling, passed from hand to hand like something too important to set down. And then, slowly, the stories started finding each other. Community meetings in church basements, folding chairs on linoleum floors, a single bare bulb overhead, women standing up and saying, "This happened to my family," and someone across the room saying, "That happened to mine too," and someone else saying, "And mine." The room going quiet in that particular way. A room goes quiet when something true has just been said in public for the first time. The dates lined up. The locations overlapped. The neighborhoods matched the maps that would later surface in government documents. The same blocks, the same streets, the same grid of houses where the machines had rolled and the fog had settled and the children had breathed the night air without knowing what was in it. The women hadn't needed the documents to know something was wrong. They had known it in the way you know things when you're paying attention, and nobody is paying attention to you. That's a particular kind of knowing. It doesn't come with proof at first. It comes with a feeling that sits in your chest and won't move. It comes with a story you keep telling because the telling is the only thing you have. And sometimes, if you tell it long enough, the proof eventually catches up. The doctors knew something was wrong. They just didn't say so out loud. That's the part that sits with you if you let it. Not the spraying, not the machines rolling through the dark. The silence that came after. The careful, measured, professional silence of people who had been told what to write down and what to leave out. In the years following the spray operations, residents of the North St. Louis neighborhoods started showing up at clinics. They came in with coughs that wouldn't quit, with headaches that settled in behind the eyes like something had taken up permanent residence there, with rashes on their arms and their children's arms, with a tiredness that sleep didn't fix. These weren't dramatic symptoms. They were the quiet kind, the kind that doctors could explain away with a dozen different causes. Bad air, stress, poor nutrition, the ordinary miseries of ordinary life. And that's exactly what most of them were told. The medical community in St. Louis at the time was not, by and large, asking questions about what the army had been doing in the streets. Most doctors didn't know. The spray operations were classified. the men in the white coats at the neighborhood clinics had no reason to connect a child's persistent cough to a military experiment they'd never heard of. They were working with the information they had, and the information they had was incomplete by design. But some people noticed patterns. A nurse who worked a clinic near Pruitt-Igoe kept informal notes. She wasn't a researcher. She wasn't trying to build a case. She just had the habit of writing things down. What she wrote over the course of several years was a quiet record of too many similar complaints coming from too small a geographic area. Respiratory problems, skin conditions, fatigue. She mentioned it to a supervisor once. The supervisor told her it was probably the building conditions. Pruitt-Igoe was notorious for its problems: mold, overcrowding, poor ventilation. There were plenty of reasons people got sick in those towers. She didn't push it. Most people didn't push it. That was a different time. The army, for its part, had its own doctors, its own researchers, its own internal reports. And those reports said clearly and consistently that the spray operations posed no health risk to the civilian population. The compound being used, they wrote, was harmless. It was a tracer material, a tool for measurement, nothing more. The people of North St. Louis had nothing to worry about. Those reports were not shared with the people of North St. Louis. The residents weren't given the chance to agree or disagree. They weren't informed that a study was underway. They weren't told that the fog rolling past their windows on a Tuesday night was anything other than weather. The Army's medical assurances existed entirely within the Army's own files, written by Army scientists, reviewed by Army officials, and filed away in Army cabinets. The loop was closed before it ever opened. What makes this the heart of the mystery isn't the spraying itself. It's the gap, the space between what the government's doctors wrote and what the neighborhood's people experienced. That gap is wide. It's quiet, and it has never been fully explained. Years later, when researchers and journalists and eventually Congressional investigators started pulling at the threads of this story, they found that gap still sitting there, unchanged. The Army's position remained that the compound was safe. But independent scientists who looked at the same data weren't so sure. Some of them pointed out that the studies used to declare the compound harmless were conducted by the same agencies that ran the experiments. That's not science. That's paperwork. One researcher, reviewing the available evidence in the 1990s, noted that the populations chosen for the spray operations were among the most vulnerable in the city. Children, elderly residents, people living in overcrowded conditions with limited access to health care. If you were designing a study and you wanted to see the maximum effect of an airborne compound on a human population, you would choose exactly the people they chose. That researchers' findings were published. They were not widely covered. The doctors who treated the residents of North St. Louis in those years were not villains. Most of them were doing their best with what they had. But what they had was a story with a piece missing. A puzzle with the most important corner left out of the box on purpose. The people who were sick didn't know why they were sick. The doctors who saw them didn't know what to look for. And the people who did know were very, very quiet about it. That kind of quiet has a weight to it. You can almost feel it, even now. There is a name at the center of this story. A name so ordinary, so clean, so forgettable that it almost works. Almost makes you nod and move on. Almost makes the whole thing feel like paperwork. They called it a vulnerability test. That's the phrase the Army used. Vulnerability test. 2 words that sound like something a doctor might say before a routine checkup. 2 words that carry no weight, no shadow, no smell of anything burning. Vulnerability test. Say it a few times, and it starts to sound like a favor. Like someone was looking out for you. The machines rolled through the streets of St. Louis. The fog drifted down. The children played in it. The mothers hung laundry in it. The old men sat on stoops and breathed it in without a second thought. And somewhere in a government office, a man with a clean desk and a clean title wrote those 2 words at the top of a page and filed it away. Vulnerability test. Now hold that name next to what actually happened. Hold it gently. Don't force it. Just let the 2 things sit side by side and see if they fit. The Army had a problem. The Cold War was young and terrifying. The Soviet Union had bombers. those bombers could reach American cities, the question keeping generals awake at night was a simple one. If an enemy plane flew over a city and released something into the air, how far would it spread? How fast? How deep into the neighborhoods? How many people would breathe it before anyone knew what was happening? You can't answer that question with a map and a pencil. You need data, real data, the kind that only comes from a real city with real air and real streets and real people going about their real lives. So they picked St. Louis, and they gave the whole operation a name designed to make it sound like maintenance, like weather monitoring, like something the city should be grateful for. Vulnerability test. A name that asked no questions and answered none. A name that pointed nowhere. This is the impossible detail, not the chemicals, not the machines, not even the secrecy. The impossible detail is the name itself, because the word vulnerability should belong to the people breathing the air. It should describe the children in the Pruitt-Igoe courtyard with no shoes on, running through the white haze on a summer morning. It should describe the grandmother leaning out her window, watching the fog settle on the street below like a low cloud that forgot to keep moving. It should describe every person in those neighborhoods who had no idea, no warning, no choice. Instead, the army used that word to describe the city's defenses. The buildings, the wind patterns, the way air moved between tall structures and low ones. Vulnerability, in their language, was a military problem, something to be measured and solved. The people were just part of the equation. There's something about the way language works in stories like this one. The right word in the right place can make almost anything sound reasonable. Vulnerability test sounds careful. It sounds scientific. It sounds like the opposite of harm. And that's exactly what it was designed to do. Words can be a kind of fog too. They drift into a room and settle on everything. They make the air feel familiar, safe. And by the time you notice something is off, the trucks are already gone, and the morning looks just like any other morning. The people of St. Louis didn't know the name. They didn't know there was a name at all. They went to work. They fed their kids. They swept their front steps and watched the weather and lived their lives the way people do when they trust that the world around them is more or less what it appears to be, and in a government file somewhere, their city was labeled, measured, categorized, given a clinical title that erased everything human about what was happening on those streets. Vulnerability test. There's a particular kind of quiet that comes with a name like that. Not the quiet of a peaceful night or a still lake or a house where everyone is finally asleep. It's the quiet of something being decided without you. The quiet of a door closing in a room you didn't know existed. The name they gave it was meant to make it sound safe. And maybe that's the strangest part of all. Because somewhere along the way, someone had to choose that name. Someone sat down and thought about it, picked those two words on purpose, and then they went home for dinner. Some people heard the story and shook their heads, not because they were cruel, not because they didn't care, but because they looked at the facts and came to a different place. They had reasons, good ones. Zinc, cadmium sulfide had been used as a tracer compound for years. The army knew it. Scientists knew it. The idea was simple. You release a fine powder into the air. You track where it goes. You learn how wind and weather move particles through a city. The compound glows under certain light. You can follow it. You can map it. That was the official purpose, and the skeptics will tell you that purpose was real. The Cold War was a time of genuine fear. Soviet bombers were not a fantasy. A chemical or biological attack on an American city was not a fantasy either. The army needed to know how an airborne agent would spread through dense urban streets, through narrow alleys, through the gaps between tall buildings. St. Louis had all of those things. So did other cities. The tests, the skeptics say, were a reasonable response to a real and dangerous world. They'll also point to the science. Zinc, cadmium sulfide, at the levels used in these tests, was not considered a serious health risk at the time. The compound had been studied. It had been reviewed. The army had documentation. Scientists who looked at the exposure levels said the amounts released were not high enough to cause the kind of harm that some people later claimed. The skeptics lean on that hard. They say the connection between the spraying and the illnesses was never proven in a clean, controlled, scientific way. And that is a fair point. It is genuinely hard to prove. You can't go back. You can't run the test again with a control group. You can't separate the spraying from the poverty, from the lead paint, from the industrial pollution that already hung over those neighborhoods like a gray curtain. The skeptics will tell you that correlation is not causation. They'll say that people get sick, that cancer clusters appear in places that were never sprayed, that grief and illness and loss are real, but they don't always have a single cause you can point to. These are not the arguments of people who want to hurt anyone. These are the arguments of people who believe in evidence. And evidence, in this case, is genuinely complicated. But here is the thing the skeptics can't quite get past. The army didn't tell anyone, not the mayor, not the city council, not the doctors at the local hospitals, not the parents pushing strollers through Pruitt-Igoe on a warm summer morning. Not one single person in those neighborhoods was told that fine particles were being released into the air above their homes. Not one person was asked. Not one signature was given. The people of St. Louis did not consent to being part of an experiment. They didn't even know they were in one. The skeptics can argue about the chemistry. They can argue about the dosage levels and the exposure windows and the difference between cadmium and zinc, cadmium sulfide. Those are real arguments, and they deserve real engagement. But the secrecy is harder to argue away. If the compound was safe, why not say so? If the tests were routine, why not announce them? If there was nothing to hide, why were the documents classified for decades? The army had a chance, many chances, to be transparent. They chose not to be. Every single time. That choice lands differently depending on who you are and where you live. If you grew up in a neighborhood that was chosen for these tests, a neighborhood that was already carrying more than its share of hardship, the secrecy doesn't feel like a bureaucratic oversight. It feels like something else. It feels like a decision made by people who believed certain lives were more available than others. The skeptics go quiet around that part, not because they're wrong about the science, but because the science was never really the whole question. The whole question was about trust, about who gets to decide what risks are acceptable, about who gets asked and who gets told nothing at all. Zinc, cadmium, sulfide might have been harmless. The army might have had the best intentions in the world, but they still looked at a city full of people and decided those people didn't need to know. That decision was made quietly. It was recorded in documents that took decades to surface. And when those documents finally came to light, even the people who believed the army's version of events had to sit with something uncomfortable. The lie wasn't in the chemistry. The lie was in the silence. There's a certain kind of person who doesn't need anyone to believe them. They saw what they saw. They know what they know. And they carry that knowledge the way you carry a stone in your coat pocket, quiet, heavy, always there. In St. Louis, those people exist. They've always existed. They were there when the machines rolled through the streets. They were there when the fog settled low over the rooftops and the children played in it, and nobody said a word about what it was. They watched. They remembered. And when the time came, they talked, not because they wanted attention, not because they had something to gain. They talked because silence felt like a second betrayal. You have to understand something about the people who lived in those neighborhoods. They were not naive. They were not simple. They were working people with sharp eyes and long memories. And they had already learned in 100 different ways that the government did not always tell the truth. They had already learned that being poor, being black, being invisible on a map meant you were also invisible to the people making decisions. So when they saw something strange, they filed it away. They told their neighbors. They told their children. And the story passed from mouth to mouth like a slow fire moving through dry grass. Some of them described the trucks the same way every time. Big and dark, moving slow, a kind of hissing sound like steam escaping a pipe. The fog that came out was white and thin, not like smoke, not like exhaust. It drifted low. It spread out over the street and the yards and the stoops where people sat in the evening air. And then it was gone, and nobody official ever explained it. Some of them went looking for answers on their own. They wrote letters. They made phone calls. They showed up at city offices and asked questions, and were told there was nothing to worry about. They were told it was a public health measure. They were told it was routine. And they nodded and they left, and they did not believe a single word. That disbelief cost something. It costs something to carry a suspicion that nobody around you will confirm. It costs something to tell your story and watch people's eyes go polite and distant. It costs something to be the person in the room who keeps saying something is wrong when everyone else has moved on. But the people who spoke up in St. Louis did not seem broken by it. That's the thing that stands out. They seemed steady, certain in the way that only comes from having lived through something real. Their certainty wasn't loud. It wasn't angry, though they had every right to be angry. It was calm, settled, the kind of calm that comes when you've already made peace with the fact that you might never get a full answer, but you're going to keep asking anyway. Some of them had lost people. A child who got sick young, a neighbor who never quite recovered from something the doctors couldn't name, a cluster of illness on one block that seemed like too much to be coincidence. They weren't claiming to have proof. They were claiming to have pattern, and pattern, they knew, was where the truth usually hid. Testing a city without telling the city requires a very specific kind of thinking. It requires you to believe that the people living there are less important than the data you're collecting from them. It requires you to look at a neighborhood full of human beings and see a controlled environment, a sample, a variable. The people who lived through those experiments understood this, even if they didn't have the clinical language for it. They understood that they had been treated as something less than citizens, and they refused to accept that quietly. There's a woman whose name appears in more than one account of this story. She's described differently depending on who's telling it. Sometimes older, sometimes younger, sometimes a mother, sometimes a grandmother. But the detail that stays the same is this: she kept records. Whatever she saw, she wrote it down. Dates, times, what the sky looked like, what the air smelled like, what her children said they felt. She kept those records for years before anyone asked to see them. That's not the behavior of someone who imagined something. That's the behavior of someone who knew from the very beginning that one day the truth would need a witness. And she intended to be ready. army had a version of the story. They always do. In their telling, the spraying was harmless, a precaution, a test of wind patterns and air movement. They said the chemical they used was safe. They said the amounts were small. They said nobody was hurt and nothing was left behind. They filed their reports, stamped their folders, and moved on to the next city on the list. But the land around sent. Louis didn't get that memo. There's something about a place that holds what happened to it. Not in any way you can measure with instruments or write up in a government report, but in the way the ground feels under your feet, in the way certain blocks feel quieter than they should, in the way the air sits heavy on a still afternoon. Even now, even decades later, even when the machines are long gone and the men who drove them are buried, walk through the old neighborhoods on the north side of the city, the ones that sat closest to the spray routes, the ones where the fog rolled in thickest on those summer nights in the 1950s, you'll notice things. The trees grow differently in some spots, not wrong exactly, just off, leaning at angles that don't match the wind. Bark that looks older than the tree should be. Roots that push up through sidewalks in places where the concrete should hold just fine. Old-timers in the neighborhood used to say the ground was restless, that it never quite settled after the war years. They didn't know why. They just knew what they saw. The buildings tell a story too. Foundations that cracked early. Walls that pulled apart from each other in ways that puzzled the contractors who came to fix them. Some of the older residents said their houses started shifting in the late 1950s, right around the time the spraying would have been heaviest. Nobody connected it then. Why would they? Nobody knew what had been floating through their windows at night. The Army's version of the story left all of that out. Their version had clean numbers and tidy conclusions. It had scientific language that sounded certain and calm. It had the weight of official paper behind it. And for a long time, that was enough. The reports sat in filing cabinets. The neighborhoods aged. The people who remembered the machines grew older and quieter, but the land kept its own record. There's a stretch of ground near where Pruitt-Igoe once stood. The towers are gone now, demolished in the 1970s. The land sat empty for years after that, Developers came and looked and left. The soil tests kept coming back strange. Not dangerous by any single measure. Just off. Just not quite right in ways that were hard to name. The ground didn't want to hold what you tried to build on it. Animals noticed too. Dogs that refused to cross certain patches of grass. Pigeons that roosted everywhere in the city except one particular block. Cats that would walk to the edge of a lot and stop, ears flat, and turn around. People laughed at them. People always laugh at animals until they stop laughing. The river remembers things differently than people do. The Mississippi runs wide and slow past the city, brown and heavy, with silt, carrying everything the land gives it. In the years after the spraying, fishermen along the North Shore noticed changes. Fish that tasted different. Stretches of bank where the catch dropped off for no clear reason. The river didn't announce anything. It just changed, quietly, the way water does. The Army's version of the story had nothing to say about any of that. Their version was built for filing cabinets and congressional committees. It was built to answer questions in a specific language. It was not built to explain why the dogs stopped at the edge of that lot. It was not built to explain the trees leaning wrong or the foundations cracking early or the fishermen pulling in less than they used to. The land doesn't speak in that language. It speaks in roots and cracks and the behavior of animals and the way water moves. It speaks slowly, over years, over decades, and it doesn't care whether anyone is listening. St. Louis kept growing. The city moved forward the way cities do. New buildings went up. New people came. The old neighborhoods changed shape. But underneath all of it, under the new concrete and the new grass and the new foundations, the ground held what it held. The Army filed their reports and called it finished. The land had a different opinion. St. Louis was not alone. That is the part that takes a moment to settle in. While the fog machines rolled through Pruitt-Igoe, while mothers wiped a strange film from their windowsills, and children played in streets that smelled faintly of something chemical and wrong, the same story was unfolding in other cities. Different streets, different names on the reports, but the same quiet logic behind all of it. Army called the broader program by different names at different times. That was part of how it worked. Names change. Labels shift. A program that sounds alarming under one title gets folded into something that sounds routine under another. And the paper trail, when it exists at all, gets scattered across filing cabinets in buildings most people will never visit. Some of those records almost didn't survive. There is a particular kind of document that government agencies produce when they are not sure whether what they are doing will look good later. It is careful, measured, full of technical language that means very little to anyone outside the room where it was written. These documents don't announce what they are. They don't say we sprayed a city. They say things like aerosol dispersal study and atmospheric vulnerability assessment. The words are chosen to describe without revealing. And sometimes those documents get lost. Not always on purpose. Sometimes a building floods. Sometimes a storage facility gets decommissioned and the boxes inside get moved, and then moved again. And somewhere in the third or fourth move, a crate goes missing. Sometimes the loss is accidental. Sometimes it is very hard to tell the difference. What researchers began to find slowly over many decades was that St. Louis fit a pattern. The same basic experiment, or something close to it, had been conducted in cities across the country. Minneapolis, Corpus Christi, Winnipeg, just across the northern border. The specific chemicals varied. The specific neighborhoods varied. But the selection process had a familiar shape. Dense populations, low income, limited political power, communities that were unlikely to organize, unlikely to be believed, unlikely to have the resources to ask the right questions to the right people. Minneapolis got its own version of the fog in the 1950s. Residents there reported the same strange haze. The same machines on trucks, the same official silence when they asked what was happening. The records from those tests were fragmentary. Pieces survived. Other pieces did not. What remained was enough to confirm the broad outlines, but not enough to answer the harder questions. Corpus Christi, down on the Gulf Coast of Texas, had a warm, salt wind that came off the water most mornings. It also had, for a period in the mid-20th century, something else drifting through the air. The documents that surfaced later were incomplete. Researchers who tried to build a full picture found themselves working with gaps. A page here, a summary there, the kind of archive that feels like it was once whole, and then, at some point, wasn't. This is what makes the St. Louis story feel bigger than St. Louis. Because when you find the same pattern in Minneapolis, and in Corpus Christi, and in a handful of other places where the records are thin and the questions are old, you start to understand that what happened in those housing projects on the north side of St. Louis was not an isolated decision made by one person in one office on one afternoon. It was part of something that had been thought through, planned, repeated. The records that survived in St. Louis survived partly by chance. A researcher in the 1990s named Lisa Martino Taylor spent years piecing together what had happened. She filed Freedom of Information requests. She tracked down documents in archives that had not been touched in decades. Some of what she found was heavily redacted. Black bars across entire paragraphs. Whole pages reduced to a few visible sentences floating in a field of ink. But enough survived, enough to show the scope, enough to show the selection, enough to show that the people making these decisions knew exactly what they were doing and chose, deliberately, not to tell the people living underneath the spray. The records that almost disappeared did not disappear entirely. That matters, because a story without documents is just a rumor. A story with documents, even incomplete ones, even redacted ones, is something harder to dismiss. The fog rolled through those streets decades ago. The machines are long gone. But the paper, what remains of it, still exists in boxes and filing rooms and microfilm archives in buildings scattered across the country. Quiet, patient, waiting for the next person willing to look. There is something about a photograph that refuses to lie. Not because cameras are honest. They aren't. But because a photograph captures what was there, whether anyone meant to show it or not. And in the late 1990s, when researchers and journalists and ordinary St. Louis residents started digging through old files and library archives, they found photographs. lots of them. And in the backgrounds of those photographs, if you knew what to look for, you could see things that didn't belong. A machine on a flatbed truck parked along a residential street. A hose running from a government vehicle toward a rooftop vent. Men in plain clothes standing near equipment that had no business being in a neighborhood like that. The kind of detail that blends into the background when you don't know what you're looking at. The kind of detail that stops your breath the moment you do. These weren't secret photographs. That's the part that stays with you. Some of them came from the Army's own files. Some came from local newspapers that had photographed the streets for entirely different reasons and caught the machines in the frame by accident. A picture of a neighborhood grocery. A picture of children playing near a fire hydrant. And there, just over a shoulder or just past a parked car, the outline of something that shouldn't have been there. The Army had kept records too. Detailed ones. Spray logs that listed dates, times, wind speeds, and locations. Internal memos that described the St. Louis operation in clinical, careful language. Words like aerosol dispersal and population density index and target area saturation. These were not the words of people who thought they were doing something harmless. These were the words of people running an experiment, and they wrote it all down. Some of those documents had been sitting in federal archives for decades, not hidden exactly, just filed, buried under the weight of other paperwork, other projects, other years. When researchers finally requested them under the Freedom of Information Act, the files came back thick and heavy, page after page of data. Charts showing wind patterns over Pruitt-Igoe. Maps with grid coordinates drawn over streets where real families had lived and slept and hung their laundry out to dry. You could hold those pages in your hands. You could feel the weight of them. There were letters too, personal ones. A city health official writing to a colleague in 1953, mentioning in passing that the Army had been in contact about a cooperative atmospheric study. The letter didn't go into detail. It didn't need to. The fact that it existed at all was enough. It meant someone in the city had known. Someone had been told, and that someone had written it down in a letter that sat in a filing cabinet for 40 years before anyone thought to look. Objects turned up too. Rusted metal canisters found during building demolitions in areas that had been spray zones. A piece of equipment recovered from a warehouse that had once been leased to a government contractor. None of it dramatic on its own. All of it together, forming a shape that was hard to argue with. Researchers began to map what they found. They laid the documents over the city grid. They matched the spray logs to the neighborhoods. They compared the dates in the Army's own files to the dates that residents remembered seeing the machines roll through. Everything lined up. The story the government had told for years. The story about harmless particles and routine testing and nothing to worry about started to show its seams. A woman named Lisa Martino Taylor spent years doing this work. She was a sociologist. She wasn't looking for drama. She was looking for the truth, the slow, careful, documented kind. She filed requests. She read files. She cross-referenced dates and locations and names. And what she assembled wasn't a rumor or a theory. It was a record. A paper record built from the government's own words that showed what had happened in those neighborhoods with a clarity that was difficult to dismiss. Her research ran to hundreds of pages. It included photographs, maps, internal Army correspondence, and contractor reports. She published it. She testified about it. And for the first time, the people of St. Louis had something they could point to. Not just a memory, not just a feeling, something solid, something real. There is a particular kind of relief that comes from holding evidence in your hands, from knowing that what you remembered actually happened, that the fog was real, that the machines were real, that the years of wondering and doubting and being told you were wrong were finally over. The questions had gotten loud enough, and the answers were right there in the files. By 1994, the questions had gotten loud enough that Congress had to sit down and listen. The hearings didn't happen because the government decided to come clean. They happened because people kept pushing. Reporters kept writing. Families kept showing up at offices with folders full of documents and names of the dead. Eventually, someone in Washington had to open a door and let them in. The Senate committee that took up the case was looking at something bigger than scent. Louis, they were looking at decades of secret testing on American citizens. Soldiers given radiation pills they didn't ask for. Mental patients dosed with drugs they didn't know about. Prisoners used as test subjects. The St. Louis spraying was one piece of a much larger picture. And that picture was not a pretty one. What came out of those hearings was slow and careful and measured. Government officials spoke in long, careful sentences. They used words that softened everything. They said things like the data suggests, and within acceptable parameters, and no conclusive evidence of harm. They were very good at that kind of language. It had been practiced for a long time. But the families who showed up to testify didn't speak that way. A woman named Lisa Martino Taylor had spent years digging through declassified Army documents. She wasn't a politician. She was a researcher. She had found records that suggested the zinc, cadmium sulfide used in St. Louis had been mixed with something else, something radioactive. She brought those documents to the hearings and laid them out like a hand of cards on a table. The Army said she was wrong. She said she wasn't. That argument is still going. What the hearings confirmed, without much debate, was that the spraying had happened, that it had been secret, that the people of St. Louis had not been told, that the neighborhoods chosen were poor, mostly black, and had very little political power. Those facts were not disputed. They sat in the record like stones in a field. What the hearings could not confirm, or would not confirm, was whether anyone had gotten sick because of it. That gap is where the family stories live. You sit at a holiday table in North St. Louis or in the old Pruitt-Igoe neighborhood, and someone starts talking. An aunt remembers her mother getting sick in the late 1950s. A cousin mentions a cluster of cancers on one block. A grandfather who worked outside every day and died young. These stories don't come with footnotes. They come with grief. They come with the particular weight of something that was never explained and never made right. The telling changes over time. That's what stories do. Some details grow sharper with each generation. Others fade out because no one alive remembers them clearly anymore. A machine on a street corner becomes a truck, then a van, just a memory of smoke. The fog that rolled through a backyard in 1953 becomes something almost dreamlike. Something that happened to someone's grandmother in a world that no longer exists. But the core of the story stays the same. The government came into our neighborhood. They sprayed something into the air. They didn't ask. They didn't tell. And people got sick. That's the version that gets passed down, not the Senate testimony, not the Army's technical reports. The version that gets passed down is the one a mother told her daughter, who told her daughter, who is now sitting at your table telling you. There's something important about that. Oral history carries things that documents don't. It carries the feeling of a place, the color of the sky on a particular morning, the way a neighborhood smelled before it changed, the names of people who never made it into any official record, but who were real and who mattered. The Congressional hearings gave the story a kind of official weight. They put it in the record. They made it harder to dismiss, but they didn't give the families what they were really asking for. They didn't give them an answer. They didn't give them an apology that felt like it meant something. They didn't give them a clear line between what was sprayed and who got sick and why. What they got instead was acknowledgement. The government admitted the spraying happened. It admitted the secrecy. It admitted that the communities chosen were vulnerable ones. And then it moved on. The families didn't move on. They're still at the table, still telling the story, still waiting for the part where someone says, plainly and without careful language, that what happened was wrong. That part hasn't come yet. There were scientists who looked at the data and said everything was fine. They had charts. They had numbers. They had the calm, steady voice of people who had spent years in labs, measuring things most of us will never see. They pointed to the levels of zinc, cadmium, sulfide found in the air. They compared those levels to what the body can handle. They wrote their conclusions in careful language, the kind of language that sounds like a door closing softly. And according to them, the door closed clean. Then there were the other scientists. They looked at the same data and saw something different. Not because they were looking for trouble, not because they wanted a fight, but because the numbers, when you held them up to the light a certain way, didn't quite add up to nothing. The exposure levels were higher than what had been reported. The duration was longer. The populations involved were more vulnerable than anyone had officially acknowledged. These scientists didn't shout. They wrote papers. They gave testimony. They asked questions in the measured, careful way that scientists do when they're not entirely sure what they're looking at, but they know it matters. That gap between the two groups, that quiet space where one set of experts said safe and another said wait, that's where the real story lives. Science is not always a clean thing. You might think of it as a machine that produces certainty, something you feed questions into and out comes truth. But that's not how it works. Science is done by people. People have assumptions. People have funding sources. People work for institutions that have interests. None of that makes them dishonest. It just makes them human. And when humans study something as complicated as long-term chemical exposure in a living city, the results get complicated too. What the residents of those St. Louis neighborhoods were left with was not a verdict. It was a fog of its own kind. Not the chemical fog that had drifted through their streets decades before, but an informational fog, a fog made of conflicting reports and technical language and studies that contradicted other studies. That kind of fog is harder to clear than any chemical spray. For the people who had lived there, who had raised children there, who had watched family members get sick and wondered why, the scientific debate wasn't abstract. It was personal. It was the difference between knowing and not knowing, and not knowing when you've already lost someone sits in you like a stone. Some of those residents spent years trying to get a straight answer. They went to meetings. They filed requests. They sat in government offices and listened to officials explain why the studies showed no definitive link. They nodded. They went home. And then they came back and asked again. Because a definitive link and no harm are not the same thing. That's the quiet truth that lives underneath all the scientific debate. You can have a study that fails to prove a connection between two things and still have a community full of people who know, in the way that people who live inside a story always know that something happened here. The body keeps its own records. The neighborhood keeps its own records. not in files or databases, but in the way people talk about the past, in the names they mention when they're sitting around a table, in the way a certain generation of a certain family seems to carry a particular kind of illness, in the stories that get passed down not because anyone decided to preserve them, but because they were too heavy to put down. Science can tell you a great deal. It can measure particles in the air. It can track disease rates across populations. It can build models of how a chemical behaves in the human body over time. These are real and valuable things. But science has a harder time measuring what it feels like to find out your neighborhood was used as a test site. It has a harder time quantifying the particular grief of learning that the people who were supposed to protect you were instead studying you. That grief doesn't need a peer-reviewed paper to be real. The scientists who said it was fine were not necessarily wrong. The scientists who said wait were not necessarily right. The truth, whatever it fully is, may never be known with the kind of certainty that closes a case. What is certain is this: something happened in those neighborhoods. Real people breathed that air. Real families lived under those clouds. And when they finally started asking questions, the answers they got were not enough. They never quite were. Close your eyes for a moment. Not really, keep listening. But imagine you're standing outside late at night, somewhere in North St. Louis. The year doesn't matter right now. Could be any year, could be tonight. The air is cool and damp. It smells like cut grass and river mud, and the faint sweetness of someone's dinner still drifting out through a screen door somewhere down the block. The street is quiet. A dog barks once, far away, then stops. The trees along the sidewalk are big and old, their roots pushing up through the concrete in slow, patient waves. Their leaves catch the orange glow of the streetlights and hold it like cupped hands holding water. You look up. The sky above St. Louis at night is never fully dark. The city breathes light upward, a soft amber haze that blurs the stars at the edges. But straight above you, if you tilt your head all the way back, you can still find them. A handful of stars, steady and cold and very far away. This is the neighborhood. This is the place. The houses here are brick, Most of them are old. Their front porches have wooden railings worn smooth by decades of hands resting on them. People sitting out in the summer heat, watching the street, watching the kids, watching the slow drift of an ordinary evening. The bricks are dark red in the daylight, almost brown at night, and the mortar between them is the color of old chalk. People lived here. Whole lives happened here. Babies were born in the back bedrooms of these houses. Children learned to ride bikes on these sidewalks, scraping their knees on the same cracked concrete squares, crying, and then laughing, and then trying again. Grandmothers sat in those porch chairs and shelled beans and told stories and watched the neighborhood the way only someone who has lived somewhere for 30 years can watch it. And on certain nights, back in the 1950s and early 1960s, something else was here too. You wouldn't have seen it clearly. That was the point. It came in low, like a ground fog, like the kind of mist that rises off a river on a cool morning. It drifted between the houses. It moved through the gaps in the fences. It settled on the grass, on the garden beds, on the windowsills, on the skin of anyone who happened to be outside. It was quiet. It had no smell that anyone could name. It looked, if it looked like anything at all, like weather. The people who lived here breathed it in. They didn't know to hold their breath. They didn't know to go inside. Some of them were already inside, and the fog found its way through the window screens anyway. Children breathed it. Old men sitting on their porches breathed it. Pregnant women breathed it. Babies in their cribs, in the dark, in the back of the house, breathed it too. Nobody rang a bell. Nobody knocked on a door. Nobody said a word. Stand here long enough and you start to feel the weight of that. Not fear exactly. Something quieter than fear. Something more like grief. The kind that comes when you understand that something was taken from people who never got the chance to say no. The families who lived in these blocks were not famous. They were not powerful. They were working people, most of them black, living in a city that had already told them in 100 different ways that their comfort and their safety were not the first concern. They went to work. They raised their children. They planted things in their yards and painted their porches and loved each other with the ordinary fierce love that people everywhere use to hold their lives together. And the government looked at them and saw a variable, a data point, a population that could be tested without consequence. The night doesn't judge. The night just holds everything equally, the grief and the beauty and the ordinary hum of a city sleeping. The streetlights buzz softly. Somewhere a car passes, its headlights sweeping across the brick faces of the houses and then moving on. A moth circles the light above a front door, patient and purposeless, going nowhere. The people who lived here are mostly gone now. Some moved away. Some grew old and died in the same houses where they were born. Some got sick. Some got sick very young. The stars above St. Louis don't know any of this. They just burn cold and steady, the way they always have, the way they will long after every last brick in this neighborhood has turned to dust. But you know, and now you can't unknow it. St. Louis was not alone in this. That is the part that takes a moment to settle in. The army didn't pick one city and call it a day. They picked dozens. They rolled their machines through the streets of Minneapolis. They sprayed aerosols over Corpus Christi, Texas. They tested the skies above Winnipeg in Canada. They worked in San Francisco, where the fog was already thick enough to hide almost anything. They moved through the country like a slow, quiet tide, and most of the people living in those cities never knew a thing. The program had a name. It was called Operation LAC, Large Area Coverage. The name sounds like something a bureaucrat invented on a Tuesday afternoon, which is probably exactly what happened. The idea was simple, in the way that troubling ideas often are. If you wanted to know how a biological weapon might spread across a populated area, you needed real data. You needed real wind patterns, real streets, real buildings. You needed real people moving through real air. So they used all of that without asking. Minneapolis got it in the winter. Residents there remembered the same thing St. Louis residents remembered. Strange machines, odd fog, a smell that didn't belong to the season. The army later confirmed that Minneapolis was part of the testing grid. The confirmation came decades after the fact, the way these confirmations always seem to. San Francisco had its own chapter. In 1950, the Navy ran a separate but related operation called Sea Spray. Ships off the coast released clouds of Serratia marcescens, a bacteria they believed to be harmless. The idea was to see how far the particles would travel inland. The particles traveled very far. Within days, 11 people at a San Francisco hospital were diagnosed with Serratia infections. One man died. His name was Edward Nevin. He was a retired pipe fitter. He had gone into the hospital for a routine procedure, and he never came home. His family spent years trying to get answers. The courts eventually ruled that the government could not be held liable. The testing, they said, had been a matter of national security. That phrase did a lot of heavy lifting during those years. The pattern across all these cities was the same. Poor neighborhoods, dense populations, communities with less access to lawyers and newspapers, and the kind of people who ask uncomfortable questions at city council meetings. The Army's own documents, the ones that survived, show that researchers specifically looked for areas where the aerosol could spread efficiently. Efficiency, in this case, meant a lot of people in a small space. It meant Pruitt-Igoe. It meant the near north side of Minneapolis. It meant the waterfront neighborhoods of San Francisco. When researchers and journalists started pulling these stories together in the 1990s and early 2000s, the full shape of the program became clearer. It wasn't a handful of experiments. It was a sustained, coordinated effort that touched nearly every region of the country. The Army tested in rural areas too, spraying from aircraft over vast stretches of open land. They wanted to know how particles behaved over flat terrain, over hills, over water. America became, for a stretch of years, one enormous outdoor laboratory. The people who lived through it in St. Louis carried something that the people in other cities also carried, a particular kind of unease. Not quite anger, not quite grief, something quieter than both. The feeling that the place you called home had been used without your permission, that the air you breathed, the air your children breathed, had been someone else's experiment, that the government you paid taxes to had looked at your neighborhood and seen data points instead of people. That feeling doesn't go away easily. It passes through families the way certain stories pass through families, not always in words, sometimes just in the way a grandmother pauses when she talks about those years, the way a father changes the subject, the way someone from Pruitt-Igoe or from the near north side of Minneapolis or from a waterfront block in San Francisco gets a certain look when the topic comes up. A look that says they already knew something was wrong, even before anyone told them what it was. The legacy of these experiments isn't just legal or political. It lives in the body. It lives in the memory of communities that were told for decades that nothing had happened, and it lives in the quiet, stubborn knowledge that when something feels wrong, when the fog doesn't smell right, when the machines come through at night without explanation, that feeling deserves to be taken seriously. Because in St. Louis, that feeling was right. There is a woman named Doris. That is not her real name, but the story is real. She grew up in the Pruitt-Igoe Towers in the 1950s, a small girl in a big building, watching the fog machines roll through the streets below her window like something out of a dream she couldn't quite name. She remembered the smell, something faintly sweet, like burnt sugar left too long on a stove. She remembered her mother pulling her back from the window and not explaining why. Doris left St. Louis in 1971. She was 19 years old, and she carried two things with her: a cardboard suitcase and a feeling she could never quite put into words. The feeling that something had happened to her neighborhood, something quiet, something that nobody was talking about out loud. She moved to Chicago first, then Detroit, then a small town in Ohio where the winters came early and the fields went gold in September. She raised children. She worked. She built a life the way most people do. One ordinary day stacked on top of another. But she never stopped asking questions. She asked her mother, who said she didn't remember the machines. She asked her aunts, who changed the subject. She asked old neighbors she found through letters and phone calls over the years, and some of them remembered and some of them didn't, and none of them had answers, just the same feeling, the same quiet unease, like a word sitting on the tip of your tongue that never quite comes. in 1994, a researcher named Lisa Martino Taylor began pulling on the threads of this story. She spent years in archives, reading documents that had been declassified, and then quietly filed away where most people would never think to look. She found the Army's own records. She found the names of the neighborhoods. She found the dates, the equipment, the chemical compounds. She found the part of the story that the government had never exactly denied, but had never exactly admitted either. And when her research finally became public, Doris was in her 60s, living in that small Ohio town. And she read about it the way you read about something you already knew in your bones, but had never seen written down in plain language. The government admitted, in pieces and over years, that the spraying had happened. They admitted that zinc, cadmium, sulfide had been used. They admitted that St. Louis was one of several cities. They admitted that the people who lived in those neighborhoods had not been told. What they did not fully admit, what they kept wrapped in careful language and qualified statements, was what the spraying had done to the people who breathed it. That part stayed soft. That part stayed uncertain. That part lived in the space between what was proven and what was felt. Doris drove back to St. Louis once, in her late 60s, to see what was left. The Pruitt-Igoe towers had been gone since 1976, demolished in stages, brought down with controlled explosions that sent clouds of dust rolling through the streets like something familiar. The land where they stood had been empty for years. Trees had grown up through the old foundations. The city had plans for the site that kept changing and never quite arriving. She stood at the edge of that empty ground on a gray November afternoon. The sky was the color of old pewter. The air smelled like cold earth and dead leaves. She stood there for a long time. She told her daughter about it later. Her daughter told her children. And that is how these stories move. Not through official channels, not through press releases or congressional testimony. They move the way water moves, finding the low places, carrying sediment from one place to the next, depositing something in the ground wherever they settle. The government's admission, when it came, was real. The documents were real. The chemicals were real. But the admission never quite reached the people it was owed to. It landed in archives and academic papers and news articles that most people never read. It did not arrive at the doors of the families who had moved away. It did not find Doris in Ohio. She found it herself, the way she had always found things, by refusing to stop looking. There is something in that, something worth sitting with. The truth came out, the way it usually does, slowly, incompletely, in pieces too small to feel like justice. But it came, and the people who carried the story in their bodies, in their memories, in the quiet unease they passed down to their children, they had been right all along. They had always known. They just hadn't had the documents yet. There are streets in St. Louis where the old-timers still go quiet when you ask the wrong question. Not angry quiet, not defensive quiet, just the kind of quiet that comes from carrying something for a very long time. The kind of quiet that settles into a person the way cold settles into old wood. Deep, permanent, not going anywhere. The Pruitt-Igoe towers are gone now. They came down in the 1970s, demolished in great clouds of dust and concrete powder, the buildings folding into themselves like tired men sitting down for the last time. The land where they stood sat empty for years. Weeds grew up through the cracked earth. Trees pushed through the old foundations. Nature moved back in slowly, the way it always does, patient and unhurried. But the people who lived there didn't disappear with the buildings. They grew up. They had children. Some of them had grandchildren, and they carried the memory of those years, the way you carry a stone in your shoe. You know it's there, even when you stop thinking about it. You feel it with every step. Ask them about the machines, the ones that rolled through the streets in the early morning hours, pushing out that low white fog. Some of them remember it clearly. The sound of the equipment, low and mechanical, like something grinding slowly in the dark. The smell that came with it, faintly sweet, faintly chemical, not quite like anything they could name. The way the mist settled over everything, soft as gauze, coating the windowsills and the parked cars and the small patches of yard between the buildings. They were told it was safe. They were told it was routine. Some of them were told nothing at all. And now, decades later, they sit with the knowledge that it wasn't routine, that the government had chosen their neighborhood with intention, that the people making those decisions had looked at a map of St. Louis and drawn a circle around the places where poor people lived, where Black families lived, where the residents had the least power to ask questions and the least chance of being believed if they did. That knowledge doesn't go away. It changes shape over the years, but it doesn't go away. Some families point to the cancers, the ones that came early and came hard, the children who got sick in the years that followed, the mothers who noticed the patterns before any doctor did, who brought their concerns to clinics and were sent home with nothing, the women who kept their own records in kitchen notebooks, writing down names and dates and diagnoses, building a case that nobody in authority wanted to see. Those notebooks still exist, some of them passed down like heirlooms, like evidence, like grief made into paper. The question that nobody has fully answered is a simple one. It sounds almost too simple for how heavy it is. The question is this: what else was in the air? The army said zinc, cadmium, sulfide, a tracer compound, a way to measure how particles moved through an urban environment. That was the official answer, and some scientists backed it up, and some scientists didn't. And the debate went on for years in conference rooms and congressional offices and academic journals that most people never read. But the families in those neighborhoods weren't asking about conference rooms. They were asking about their children. They were asking about the years of illness that followed. They were asking why the army had chosen them specifically, and not the neighborhoods a few miles west where the houses were bigger and the residents were whiter and the lawns were green and well kept. That question has never been fully answered either. There's a particular kind of unresolved thing that a community carries when it knows it was used, when it knows that somewhere in some office a decision was made about its people, and that decision was made without asking, without informing, without any of the basic courtesies that human beings owe each other. That knowledge lives in the body. It passes through families. It shows up in the way people talk about authority, about trust, about who gets protected and who gets experimented on. The neighborhood remembers, not as a single voice, not as one clean story, but in pieces, in fragments, in the particular way that real memory works. Scattered, incomplete, true. The fog is long gone. The machines stopped rolling through the streets before most of the grandchildren were born. The towers came down. The records were buried and then found and then argued over. But the people are still here, and they still remember the mornings when the air tasted wrong. Some secrets are kept in locked rooms. Some are kept in files with black bars drawn through the words. And some are kept in the open air, drifting through neighborhoods on a Tuesday morning, invisible and quiet, while children play on the sidewalk below. The St. Louis story was never really hidden. Not completely. The machines rolled through the streets in broad daylight. Neighbors watched them from porches. People asked questions. The answers just never came, not for a long time, and not all at once, and not without someone pushing hard to get them. That is the strangest part of all of this. The secret wasn't buried deep. It was just told in a language most people didn't know to look for. Numbers in a report. A chemical name that sounded harmless. A study filed away in a drawer that nobody opened for 20 years. The hiding wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. It was patient. It was the kind of hiding that works because most people are busy living their lives. And the people of those neighborhoods were busy. They were raising children, working jobs, cooking dinner, watching the evening news. They were doing what people do. They were trusting that the world around them was what it appeared to be. That trust was not foolish. It was human. It is what most of us do every day without thinking. The women who noticed the patterns. The ones who counted the sick children, who wrote the letters, who sat in the hard chairs at public hearings and spoke into microphones. They were doing something old and necessary. They were paying attention. They were refusing to let the story end before it was finished. Because of them, the story didn't end. It kept going. It moved through decades. It moved through courtrooms and congressional offices and university research labs. It moved through the memories of people who grew up in Pruitt-Igoe, who remembered the fog machines, who carried the story the way you carry something heavy. Not because you want to, but because you know someone has to. That is what folklore is at its heart. It is the things a community refuses to forget. Not because forgetting would be wrong exactly, but because the memory belongs to the people who lived it, and nobody else gets to decide when it's over. The Cold War ended. The buildings came down. The neighborhoods changed. The files were released, slowly, reluctantly, piece by piece, and the story got clearer. Not all the way clear. It never got all the way clear. There are still questions that don't have answers. There are still numbers that don't add up. There are still people who got sick and never knew why, and families who still wonder. That wondering doesn't go away. It lives in the body. It lives in the stories people tell at kitchen tables, to their grandchildren, to anyone who will sit still long enough to listen. Tonight, St. Louis is quiet. The old neighborhoods are dark. The streets where the fog machines rolled are empty now, lit by orange streetlights that hum softly in the cold. The Mississippi is out there to the east, moving slow and black and wide, the way it always has, the way it will long after all of us are gone. The arch stands over the city like a silver crescent, catching the last of the light. Below it, the city breathes. People are sleeping. Babies are dreaming. Old men are sitting in chairs by windows, watching the street the way old men do. The night is deep and still and full of the ordinary sounds of a city at rest. A distant car, a dog somewhere, the low moan of a train crossing the river. The sky above is clear. The stars are out. The air is just air. And somewhere in that city, someone knows the story. Someone remembers. Someone will tell it again tomorrow to someone who has never heard it, and that person will carry it forward, and it will keep going the way all true things keep going. Not because anyone decided to preserve it, but because it is real, and real things have weight. And weight doesn't disappear just because someone stops looking at it. The fire is low now. The night is deep. The story is told, but it was never really a secret. It was always waiting for someone to say it out loud. And now you have heard it. Subscribe for a brand new mystery every night. One tap and a new story is waiting for you tomorrow. Sleep well.